Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. And so what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. You've probably noticed the rising prices and cost of living this year. Everyone is feeling the squeeze on pocketbooks as everyday essentials are becoming more and more expensive due to inflation. I'll be the first to admit a lack of knowledge in economics and in the factors that drive inflation. That's why I'm glad to welcome Tho Bishop to the show today. Tho and I discussed a lot in this conversation. We began by talking about Ludwig von Mises and the Austrian School of Economics. Tho then explained the bad monetary policies and history that has led to the economic woes that we're facing now. We finished by talking about Tho's recent spiritual journey to Christianity and what he's learned. I've got to say that I was impressed by Tho's intellectual honesty and thoroughly enjoyed our time together. Tho Bishop is an assistant editor for Mises Wire. Prior to working for the Mises Institute, he served as deputy communications director for the House Financial Services Committee. His articles have been featured in the Federalist, the Daily Caller, and Business Insider. Before we get into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to our email list so that you can get all of the latest content sent directly into your inbox. Visit the link in the show notes and you can sign up on my website. Also, be sure that you're subscribed to Filter wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get all future episodes right on your homepage. If you're helped by this content, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a rating and review or share the show with your friends. Leave Filter a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple and write us a review on Apple Podcasts. This only takes a minute of your time, but whenever you take these simple steps, it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into my conversation with Tho Bishop. Tho, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
Well, glad to have you here, man. I've been looking forward to having you on. I've been following you on Facebook for a little while and really enjoyed your ideas and commentary, thoughts on a lot of different topics. It's been an enlightening follow for sure. But why don't you, for our audience who are just getting to know you, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now, working at Mises, what your role is there, and how you got there.
Yes, I'm an associate editor for the Mises Institute, which means I get to write articles and all sorts of different types of content and work with a lot of great economists, a lot of great scholars, and try to promote their work, which is a great honor. I think the organization had certainly made a lasting impact on my life. And I think that the ideas of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and the Austrian school that, we're there to promote, I think are important, not simply for, just for civilization itself. I think there's a lot of important value there. Prior to that, I worked for the House Financial Services Committee. I was a kind of a Ron Paul, 2012, a little bit before that, but kind of a Ron Paul baby back in the day. And when you coupled that with the financial crisis, that's what really got me interested in Austrian economics back then. And so I was given an opportunity to actually be able to work when the Tea Party took over in 2010, work with the Financial Services Committee. I was kind of the Ron Paul's mole, trying to get some good Austrian economics content out in front of members and staffers and things like that. So I got a little bit of time in DC, a little over 3 years, and then been with the Institute since about 2015. And again, one of my favorite organizations prior to that. And so I've been living a very good life.
Yeah. Yeah, Ron Paul is originally who got me interested in politics. I had no interest at all before that. Didn't understand much at all. Still don't. I'm far from an expert, and certainly learning every day. But yeah, Ron Paul is he was the guy who kind of gave me my political awakening back in the day, and definitely still hold to a lot of things that I learned from him back then. What is it that got you that first step towards working in DC and economics and so on? Did you go to school for that? Was it always something you were interested in, or was there something prior to? Was it 2012? You said that when you started working in DC in the House and all.
Well, I'd always been interested in politics as a whole. My parents were political consultants. My father was a political strategist for a very long time. He actually helped with Ron Paul's first successful special election campaign back in the day. So He also helped Newt Gingrich get elected, so maybe a trade off there. But so I grew up, listening to Rush Limbaugh all the time and really consuming a bunch of political content, and so being a high schooler and during the 2000s, during the Bush years, I was very, I started off as a big supporter of the Iraq War, kind of just a general supporter of the Bush administration as a whole. And then I started realizing as time went on, there's things, I became much harder to defend the Iraq War. It became harder to kind of just trust that the Republicans knew exactly what they were doing. And then all of a sudden you have, during the 2008 election, you have Ron Paul come on the stage and just start speaking truths that were not, within the kind of neat confines of, Fox News opinion, pieces. And that kind of opened my eyes into a whole different realm of thinking, which, made me interested in libertarianism, made me interested in Austrian economics, and kind of exploring some of these different sort of rabbit holes. And so it was then just after 2010, seeing you obviously had this big populist sort of uprising against the over Obamacare and the abuses of physical spending and a lot of the economic irresponsibilities that both parties were promoting. That kind of got me interested and it was very interesting to be getting up to DC, kind of seeing behind the scenes on this, where you started what are the mechanisms that leads a generation of Republicans voted on a fiscally responsible sort of pushback, leading them to be voting for all sorts of ridiculous spending packages and kind of losing any sort of backbone they had, and in that Ron Paul fervor, and you can definitely see the different tools that DC has to kind of capture anyone that kind of comes within its orbit, which was, again, very interesting to see as a young 20-something-year-old staffer.
I'm sure. Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned, going through your own, I guess, transformation of being an Iraq War defender to hearing Ron Paul speak some truths where it started to become a lot harder and harder to defend it. I had a good buddy of mine who was a hardcore Ron Paul supporter. He loved him, talked about him all the time, and we used to pick at him and joke because, we would go eat out we were at Buffalo Wild Wings one time, and just out of nowhere, he says, "If I could, I'd pay for this meal in gold coins." And we're like, "Oh gosh, okay." So he was a character. But finally, I started to listen to Ron Paul and say, "Okay, so what's with this guy?" And it was him speaking on the Iraq War and Afghanistan and all that, and the things he had to say that initially would hooked me to realizing, okay, I think this guy's onto something. He's saying something that's really, really resonating and sounding different from what I'm hearing from everyone else. So yeah, very similar in my own story with him.
Yeah, well, and I think that's kind of the interesting thing about Ron Paul is that I think people there are a lot of kind of generic your average Fox News viewer who loved Ron because he would talk about the Constitution and things that the conservative movement particularly if you think about the Reagan years, right? This was their motivating sort of ethos, right? It was we were going to restore the Constitution. We're going to rein in this out of control state. But then it'd be the quirky things that he liked to fixate on, like the Fed. How many times did you hear, "Oh, I like what Ron Paul has to say, but he's a little crazy on the war issue because we've got to make sure that we're defending our freedoms abroad." It's those little things that I think were off-putting to some people that I think you look back in 2022. It was the quirkiness that were the most important things that he was saying, right? The warning of the creeping police state growth and those dynamics, those the things that made him kind of branded as a conspiracy theorist or kook or whatever. That's the parts of his message that I think were the most important things that he was harping on, and I think that time has vindicated him a great deal. I think it's not a coincidence that you saw Donald Trump tap into a lot of those concerns that he had that not even his son was necessarily good at communicating at. And I think that the Republican Party that you have today is a lot more like Ron Paul in 2012 than it was any other candidate on the stage. And I think it's been interesting to see that transition over time.
Yeah. So anyway, so you were in DC, but now you're in the free state of Florida,
yes.
Right?
And the best part of the free state of Florida, and the Florida Panhandle.
All right, all right. And so you went from one swamp to another.
Yes.
I guess you could say, and you're working with Mises now. Tell us a little bit about the man behind the institution, Ludwig von Mises, and what the institute's all about today.
Yeah, well, definitely our namesake. The reason why it's called Austrian Economics is that this kind of specific school of thought was really developed and cultivated at University of Vienna. Started with the work of Karl Menger, who was even recognized by the mainstream as being one of the original members of what's called the Marginalist Revolution, which was economists trying to reckon with that question on why are diamonds valued more than water when water is so much more important for us, and it goes into marginal utility, and it's in that as a means of understanding value. The Austrian school is it's radically subjectivist in its understanding of value, so dismisses the ideas of the labor theory of value, which are core not only to Karl Marx, but were also baked into Adam Smith and a lot of neoclassical economics. And so even, there's a lot of different schools of thought that might have, kind of a macro lens. Milton Friedman, for example, in the Chicago school, they are seen by many as some of the most prominent defenders of free markets, but the methodology behind it is very different for the Chicago school than the Austrian school, because we reject the use of mathematical modeling. We reject these sort of positivist means and methods of understanding the economy. We view the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics as being false distinctions, right? That economics at the end of the day is about understanding human decisions in a environment of scarce resources. That what aligns the allocation of these scarce resources in a way to promote human thriving. Understanding kind of all costs or essentially opportunity costs and things like that. And so, you open up an Austrian economics book and you're going to see a lot of words. It is I think it's been described as a literary form of economics. It's very logical in its presentation of things. A lot of kind of logical deduction is kind of core to understanding sort of economic laws and rules that guide our understanding of the world as it is. Where other schools are a lot more mathematical in focus. They have a great reliance upon certain sorts of modeling, which can allow, with the idea being that we can predict future behavior from these models and try to use that to identify changes that need to be made on a policy landscape or to better understand future performance of a good or service, right? And so it is a distinct, different, it's a fundamentally just different view of understanding economics as a discipline in itself, rather than a political program. It's not simply, an understanding of Austrian economics tends to make you a laissez-faire capitalist, but it is not it's not it itself is different than those policy outcomes. And so that's what makes the act of promoting these ideas so interesting, because it's really educational to its core. And so Ludwig von Mises, who we're named after, he was a student of Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, who was a student of Menger. So he traces right back to the founder of the school. He himself was a veteran of World War I. After he'd already written a great book on money, right? So you just think about the massive change of his life, seeing, fellow teachers, professors, seeing his students die in World War I, seeing the collapse of his nation, of the government, of this governing body that he was born into collapse around him. And he thought a great deal of the Habsburg Empire. And then seeing the chaos in between the two world wars. He was not only a free market economist, but he was a Jewish free market economist. And the Nazis didn't like either part of that. So he actually had to flee his home. His library was confiscated by the Nazis. I mean, he was high up on the enemies lists of the state because they recognized that his ideas were a threat to the Nazi regime.
Wow,
they tried to assassinate him in Switzerland, which is where he fled to for a little bit, and he ended up in New York. America at this point was so far to the left that in FDR's America, he could not get a paying teaching job in the United States university system, in spite of, again, being world renowned as as a pioneer in monetary theory and other important issues of the day. So he ended up actually spent the rest of his life benefiting from enjoying the patronage of business leaders that recognized that his defense of free markets was very important within this increasingly hostile American intellectual environment. And from there at New York, he was able to have a graduate program at the University of New York paid for by patrons. And from there, he's able to kind of rebuild the Austrian school by bringing in new talents and new scholars, one of which is Murray Rothbard, who was a founding academic vice president of the Mises Institute, a very prolific scholar in his own right. One of his students back in Austria was F.A. Hayek, who went on to win the Nobel Prize the year after Mises died. There's some conspiracies there about how they didn't want to give Mises that credit because he was rewarded on was Austrian business cycle theory, which he worked on with Mises. So there was a lot of cross collaboration there. But it's interesting when you see the modern day products of this sort of intellectual school. It's not only a lot of, I think, great scholars that around the world that have been inspired by his ideas, but it's also things like Wikipedia was inspired by an essay by F.A. Hayek on the use of knowledge in society and the way of kind of creating, that a encyclopedia that's edited by the masses is going to have more knowledge than what could be contained by a single writer. Bitcoin was inspired by Austrian understandings of money. It was kind of modeled after the gold standard that Ludwig von Mises was very much a defender of. And so, you can also see not only these ideas within, ivory towers, which the Austrian school has long been discriminated against within mainstream economics, because again, the methodologies are so different. But they've paid off, I think, in the real world in ways that are very interesting. And I think in a time of, when we're seeing inflation levels at historic highs, I think that very much the same way that in 2008, 2009, you saw a resurged interest in Austrian economics because of our understanding of booms and busts. I think that you're seeing again today a renewed interest in Austrian economics because we were kind of warning about the inflationary pressures of everything that happened in 2020 in a way that a lot of the mainstream, including the central bankers, the Federal Reserve and the like, did not. And so when you have a breakdown of a recognition that the experts were wrong, and when it comes to economics these days, the experts were very wrong. That always kind of leads to a renewed interest in kind of heterodox schools of thinking, and the Austrian school would definitely be considered heterodox, but I don't think that makes it any. But I think that a lot of world events are demonstrating the value of kind of our lens when applied to current issues.
Yeah. Why do you think the mainstream economists got it wrong again recently? And so we're about to go into another big recession. Inflation's crazy high. Whenever we kind of went through all of this like 14 years ago, right, in 2008, it seems like there's these recurring financial crises that mainstream economists miss again and again.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. One, I think at the most basic level, it was the normalization of the idea that money is simply is naturally an extension of the state, and so it can be difficult for us to realize because we've grown up in an age of fiat money, right? Nixon closed the gold window in the 70s. Americans, we couldn't redeem our dollars for gold since FDR, but this era of fiat money, where basically the backing of our money is purely the judgment of PhDs. This is only 50 years old, right? We had the 50-year anniversary of it last year.
So can you just define fiat currency? Is that what it would be?
Yeah, it's the value of the dollar is a product of the government saying it has value. Okay. And so you have to pay your taxes in the dollar, right? So therefore, that's what gives it its value. The government also protects it from competition of others, right? From other currencies. If you hold gold, right, you have to pay a capital gains tax on it if you exchange it for dollars, right? And so the backing of the dollar is directly connected to the state. And the Federal Reserve is an extension of the state, even though it's nominally private. I think that distinction isn't as important as some people make it to be. But essentially, though, when you took away what money was an independent measure. It was a depoliticized measure. And if you look at the history of the gold standard, there's issues with the way that the government would come in and intervene when you had banks making bad loans, right? And there's different policy mistakes that led to various issues under the gold standard. It wasn't perfect. Actual workings of banks and government, still found various ways of creating issues there. But ultimately, though, there's some sort of measure that was independent of political influence that you could kind of use as a measure. That went away when you took gold out of the system. And again, this is only 50 years old. And what that led to, though, was the creation of monetary economists that started believing in their own powers of using money itself as a extension of government policy. Now, what happened, and it became increasingly more, there was escalation in the way that it was used, right? From gold. Alan Greenspan, for example, was able to create a kind of a big cult of personality around him because they thought that he was called the maestro because he could, the idea was that he could use money to lift us out of recessions and be very good at using money as kind of a tool to make sure the economy never got too hot, never got too low. But what, a lot of what you ended up doing was creating business cycles where, when you had the stock market, for example, you had the stock market bubble at the 2000, 2001, along with 9/11, Greenspan lowered interest rates, which instead of addressing the malinvestment that was made within the stock market, you ended up fueling a new bubble, which was the housing crisis, right? So you had the housing bubble that then pops in 2008. Yeah. And so again, allowing that bad debt to really get to be circled out, the Fed allowed, they bought up a bunch of the bad products from the banks. They flooded the banking system full of cash. And this kind of gets to the second point. The reason why you saw increasing aggression from central bankers after 2008 is that in spite of flooding the banking sector full of cash, we didn't see the price inflation we're seeing now. And so what you had was people thinking that you had a story that professed that economic experts could tell themselves that our previous understandings of inflation were wrong because we didn't see consumer price inflation. And therefore, we have more tools at our disposal than we thought. And that led to a far more aggressive approach to 2020 and all of the runoff of the dealing with all the ramifications from the COVID regime. That if you look like the money supply increases 2008 and 2020, it's 2020 just dwarfs it, and 2008 dwarfed everything that came prior. The problem is that they learned the wrong lessons from 2008. Because what happened in 2008 is while we didn't have consumer price inflation, we had massive asset inflation. You saw stock markets going through the roof. You saw, different. We inflated a whole bunch of different bubbles, and we also paid banks not to lend out money. Whether it's excess on interest reserves, like we were literally paying banks not to lend it out to the real economy. And so what that did is that created a very protected class of powerful institutions closest to the Fed, big tech, for example. You get a lot of money flowing into big tech, big pharma, various military contractors, right? When money is printed, it doesn't just, it doesn't hit everyone equally. It goes through channels that the Federal Reserve controls, right? With COVID, we printed a whole bunch of money, and we were thinking of new ways of getting it out, right? We had Trump bucks, we had PPP loans, right? We printed money and we got it out as many places as possible, and so the tools were different. Like and the Fed, I think, and they're more or less admitting this now. Central bankers didn't expect it to backfire the way it has, and I think a lot of this is just increasing generations of professional, highly trained economists getting more and more arrogant with the tools of central banking. And believe very much in the same way that Fauci was able to grant himself these incredible tools from this role of unelected technocrat. The central bankers have been doing a very similar thing for at the very least, I would argue since Greenspan, but at the very least since Bernanke. And there's, they overstated, they overthought what they could control. And the scary thing is, and the one thing that's been helping America is that we're not alone on this. The strength of the dollar comes from the fact that every other central bank, with a few exceptions, one of them being Russia, actually, every other country has been binging on debt with these low interest rates. They've been engaging in, Europe's had negative interest rates. Japan's had negative interest rates. Switzerland's had, once upon a time, right? Swiss banks were thought to be the best in the world. The Swiss have been doing a lot of the same reckless, irresponsible spending. And so what we've done is that the really bad intellectual climate of America, your Ivy League trained economists that think that they have all these tools that they really don't. They don't have that humility that economics, I think, really teaches you. They're now, they're throughout the world, and you've had a mass blanket of central bankers all around the world engaging in the same, if not worse, reckless policy that we've had. And now we're in a situation where they're trying to backtrack now, and it's not quite. The people that didn't think that inflation was going to be temporary last year are now trying to reassure us that they absolutely know what to do on dealing with inflation now. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for us to question that.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer there, but there are layers and layers to this issue that this is a multi-decade long problem that has brought us to the situation we are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. So this is the first time I've heard someone, or at least that I can remember. Maybe I heard someone else saying and just missed it. But first time I've heard someone connect the inflation we're experiencing right now to policies in 2008. It seems as though everyone else I've been hearing has only been referring it or relating it back to all the stimulus packages that we had during COVID, which I guess it makes sense. Those stimulus packages found their origin in what the government did in 2008, but those were going directly to certain industries, right?
Right. So we created, so the policy tools that were used in 2020 were created in 2008. And more importantly, they were then used in 2010. And that's important because that was after the crisis. And so what basically you had is that we had a radical transformation in how central banks operate, which is kind of a big deal. It would be like completely throwing out the operations of, which we've also kind of done this, but it'd be like completely throwing out the standard operations of like how a bill is passed, right? We completely threw it out the window. And there's actually a recent book that came out, The Lords of Easy Money by Christopher Leonard. Every time the author gives his own opinion on economic policy, like discard it, like his views are really, really bad. But there's a lot of fascinating history there, where because you had even members of the Federal Reserve uneasy with how the Bernanke Fed was using these extreme policy tools after the crisis. And the problem is that when an economy gets addicted to cheap money, there's consequences to that. And so what we have, and this goes beyond simply inflation too. And the inflation is simply one aspect of it. This large corporate consolidation. So like the concerns about big tech censorship, a big part of that is that when you're in a low interest rate environment and you're a big institute, you're a big business, your ability to take on debt is subsidized by that Federal Reserve policy. And so if you're Facebook and you want to buy Instagram or WeChat or whatever, what you're not having to take out, pay for it out of cash. You're taking on debt to make these acquisitions, and that debt was made unnaturally cheap because of the extreme low interest rate policies that the Fed was pushing. And so what we've done is and then you also have cultural consequences, because if you were out there and you listen to Dave Ramsey, who tells you never use your credit card and that debt is bad and pay off your mortgage at the fastest rate you can, well, in a sane world and just world, that's good advice. The problem is that we're living in a clown world. And so if you are paying off your mortgage, as quickly as you can, when you're borrowing at 3%, that's not necessarily, when you have, when you're living in an inflationary environment, that's, your inflation's at 6%, your mortgage is at 3%. Like you should be slow paying off your mortgages, because the debt, your debt is inflating away faster than you can pay it off. And so we are actively rewarding short-term decision-making at the expense of long-term decision-making. We're destroying our capital base. If you're an insurance company, if you're a pension fund, and you need, historically you would own a lot of government bonds, very, very safe, products that had a yield to it because you need reliable returns later on to pay off the pensioners that are now retiring. Well, what we've done is with low interest rates, we've made those pension funds and those insurance companies have to have a lot more exposure to the stock market because conservative assets are yielding you nothing. And so therefore you're having to now buy Uber stock. You're having to buy Netflix stock. And so we've pushed so much risk into traditionally conservative investors. If you were parking your money at the bank with no interest rate, you're not getting any return. So why wouldn't you put it in the stock market and gamble, right? We've massively increased the risk in the financial system. And then when you when you have a black swan event, like nobody could have prevented coronavirus, right? Then that's where that risk really pops up. And when you start, and now that they're having to reverse these policies to deal with that inflation issue, we're going to end up finding that there's a lot of very, very large businesses that are going to be considered systemically important because the impact that they're going to have when they fail in the economy is going to be huge. And so and of course, at the end of the day, it's normal people that work in paycheck to paycheck. They're the ones that never benefited from this recovery, right? During the Trump years, you started seeing some increase in like worker wages and things like that. Average Americans were totally screwed by the policies of the last 10 years. If you are in Wall Street, if the more exposure you had to stocks or financial assets, you were doing, good times were here again. You were making hand over fist, particularly during 2020. That's why you had so many people like jumping into Robinhood and getting their exposure into stocks, right? Investing in companies that they had no idea what the underlying businesses were. Yeah. That's and again, there's consequences to this that are, I don't think the Federal Reserve fully understands, and I would question anyone to make the argument that they do. And again, there's a lot of stuff here that should be troubling.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's no shortage of troubling issues here. What would be the Austrian answer to? I mean, I know there's a lot of problems and issues, but I got just this inflationary issue that we've been talking about the last few minutes.
Well, the way that Austrians kind of view booms and busts generally, what makes us different is that the policy solutions to a boom and bust is to try to reverse the bust, right? To the Austrians, the bust is important. The bust is what heals. The bust is what allows for the liquidation of bad loans to be made. And look, so that answer would have meant, banks in 2008 making a bunch of bad mortgages would have failed, and so we would have had a failure of a lot of banks. And like there would have been real pain in that. Like people that there are consequences to that. What Austrians would kind of argue though is that there's no way of bypassing that. You only kind of shift those costs either in the future into other people, right? Often, maybe the government gets like the Fed comes in and buys out all those sort of things. So now the Federal Reserve, and by that extension, the taxpayers are now on the hook for it. Like the Federal Reserve now owns more mortgages than any other institution in the country, which again, in a time of rising mortgage rates, like we'll see how that goes. And so the Austrian the way that we would view things is that the problem fundamentally is the government manipulation of money and credit. And that if we want to create a society that can have sustainable growth and to not be governed by these crazy winds of booms and busts, that we need to allow the market to handle money and banking the same way that it handles every other service. And I think if you're looking for like real policy solutions, Ron Paul would talk about ending the Fed, and I think that should be the objective. A piece of that would simply to be allow for competition with the Fed. And so what I've been talking to some congressional candidates and Senate candidates and things like that is that if Republicans really wanted to have an answer to this, and I think they need one. If looking at polling, inflation is the number one political issue out there, and Republicans' answer is kind of generic rhetoric about cutting spending, which they've never done, right? So I don't have faith because Trump ran on this. Trump in 2016 was on CNBC saying low interest rates screw over the little guy, and then when you get in power, he was, let's keep rates as low as possible, even when the economy is growing, because you don't want to be the person that sees the bubble collapse on you. Like that's not your electoral outcome, right? So assuming that Republicans aren't going to get serious about spending and do the really painful reforms necessary, the best thing would simply be allowing average Americans to have lifeboats off. And if you allow, again, I would eliminate capital gains taxes on gold, silver, cryptocurrency, all these alternative assets that can be, if you allow Americans to save save in Bitcoin rather than the dollar, and then cash out when they need to make purchases without having to pay, the capital gains on that, I think that would be a situation where Americans can start taking, would be in a much stronger situation. And so that's something that could be done within any sort of tax cut bill, which only needs 50 votes, which I think procedurally is a very good thing given how divided American politics is, and I don't expect that to solve anytime soon. But you allow Americans to save outside of the dollar, because I don't think there's a way of saving the dollar at this point. I don't think there's a way of saving the Fed. The only thing that is keeping us afloat is, again, the fact there's nowhere else to go with your money. You can't take your money. I think conservatives are overly bullish on China. Like, I don't think China's really an economic threat. I think they're closer to the Soviet Union in the mid 1980s, which collapsed, had their economy collapse on them because of their own reckless. The beauty of central planning is that it doesn't work for anyone. It's not just bad for Americans, right? So I don't think China's the rival there. I don't think. I mean, Europe is destroying itself in a variety of ways. There's nowhere else to go, and that's what's keeping the dollar to be as strong as it is. But I think that what will be interesting is when people start moving to gold, Bitcoin, non-politicized forms of money. And the more that we can allow Americans to do that now, I think the better off we're going to be in the long run. And I would love to start seeing, if Florida stopped holding cash and instead start buying gold, I think that would do a lot for state sovereignty in ways that are interesting. Where you've had Texas create a gold bank, you've had other places kind of do interesting things. Wyoming's done some interesting stuff with Bitcoin. So those are some of the policy tools that I would like to see and try to navigate this sort of stuff.
Hey guys, just a quick break to talk to you about my new sponsor here on the podcast, Zencastr. Zencastr is the tool that I use to record the remote interviews that I do here for the podcast. Whenever I decided that I was going to start doing remote interviews, talking to people who I would have to do over the internet, I looked at several different tools. I didn't want to use Zoom because honestly, Zoom just doesn't give you a really good quality product at the end in terms of audio and video quality. I looked at some of the other services out there, but I didn't find anything that was easy to use and that worked as well as Zencastr. I love Zencastr because they have tools for running post-production. They give you separate audio and video files for both you and your guests, and they come all in super high quality, crystal clear audio, HD video that you can't get from using other over the internet streaming services. I love Zencastr, and Zencastr is offering my listeners a 30% off of their pro plan for 3 months whenever you use my link to sign up. So just go to the link that I have in the description below or in my show notes, and you can sign up for a free trial of Zencastr and then to get 30% off your first 3 months with a pro account. I love Zencastr. I've been using them for the podcast for at least a year now, and I highly recommend them. So go and sign up through that link so that you can get 30% off your Zencastr Pro account. Now, let's get back into this episode. So that's where one of the potentials of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies come in. I noticed that you usually only say Bitcoin and not crypto. Are you a fan of crypto in general, or are you only a fan of or interested in the potential of like just Bitcoin?
I'm pretty open-minded, but I do think that there are. I think that there is a lot of scams in crypto. I think a lot of people underestimate the benefits that Bitcoin has, which again is there's not a third-party foundation in charge of it. There's not a CEO of Bitcoin where if he dies tomorrow, if thing crashes. It's boring. It's old technology, but it works. And I think that there are benefits to that simplicity. And I think ultimately what gives Bitcoin its value will necessarily be how it's so far the state can't control it. And I think it's a lot easier for the state to control Ethereum. I think the state's a lot easier to control some of these other cryptocurrencies. Could we have a situation where you have a lot of other cryptocurrencies operating alongside of it? Maybe. I'm not going to dismiss that. I think it'd be arrogant to dismiss any sort of outcome. And I think that there is a arrogance that can come into some of the stuff because we see the economic logic of something like, you had a lot of people that bought a ton of gold in 2010 expecting hyperinflation, and it didn't work. And so, because there's a lot of irrationality in market, there's all sorts of stuff that can lead to things not playing out in the short term. So I don't want to be overly, maybe there are some currencies that are going to have unique bells and whistles that make it, more beneficial, that provide values unique from Bitcoin itself. I think Bitcoin, if you're a normal person and you're just looking to protect yourself and you're not going to try to, obsess over trading and things like that, my suggestion is just to buy and hold Bitcoin, and you might not be getting the most high upside play, but I think holding Bitcoin responsibly, which means not having it on exchanges, knowing how to manage your own wallet. To me, that is the safest way of saving with Bitcoin, and everything else, play that at your own risk and do whatever. I also think there's value in not just simply being 100% in on Bitcoin either. Like I own some gold, I own some silver. Like I think there is value in, because again, who knows what's going to happen. I think economics at its best, it teaches you two lessons. It teaches you who is ripping us off, and it teaches you humility. And if you don't have those two takeaways, then you're not understanding economics properly. And so that's kind of, I've had to learn some of these lessons the hard way, but that's kind of where I am at this point.
Yeah. So there's some interesting things going on in the news that I think presents some that calls for some thoughtful analysis from people who are typically free market guys, and that being this controversy or fight going on between Disney and Florida. You being in Florida, I'm sure that you're very, very aware of everything going on. But so DeSantis just signed in that they're taking away Disney's special tax privileges as a direct consequence of their involvement in the parental rights and education bill. Typically free market guys and libertarian leaning people don't like to see the government responding or doing what this appears to be on the surface, punishing a private entity for political speech. What's your take on all that going on right now, and the implications it has, or what it calls for analysis from a free market perspective?
Well, one important part that I think it's overlooked on that bill is that it doesn't take away those privileges until next year. And I think that there is an intentional time delay there, which I think might end up leading to a peace treaty down the line if Disney plays ball, which I think is interesting, because it is something where my positions have changed a great deal on this, being in Florida and seeing that a lot of the tools that made DeSantis so powerful, so effective, let me put it that way, in COVID were things that I would typically be against, right? One of the things that separated Florida from a lot of other states is that he reined in, he declawed what local governments could do. So if you were a local school board, you could not decide to mask your kids, right? He took away that power, which as a political decentralist at heart that prefers to have decisions made as close to the people as possible, that goes against that. The problem is that what he recognizes that you have a federal regime that was using every tool at its disposal to create, to decentralize Fauciism, to decentralize what was an authoritarian regime, which is what we had. A part of that was also corporate enforcement. And so, when it came to governing vaccine mandates, it was corporate America far more than the state that was effectively the enforcement wing. And I'm a property rights guy. I don't think that the government has any business on telling a business who they can and cannot hire. The problem is that we're living in a world where, one, we have a civil rights regime. We do not have a property rights regime. I would prefer a property rights regime, but what I've come to, and at least this is the rationalization I've given to myself, if a libertarian out there wants to say this is being selling out principles, perhaps there's some truth in that. But I think that if we're the only ones that care about our principles and they're used against us, then I think that it's going to be detrimental to our liberty. And so if you only have the right to discriminate against political dissidents, which is the way that I'd classify anyone who was questioning Fauci in the vaccine, then you're going to have private tyranny against political dissidents. And I think that's bad for liberty. And to a certain extent, I'm not going to go along with it, because I want the world to play by these set of rules that I personally hold. Ultimately what protected my liberty was not the Constitution. It was not an appeal to natural rights. It was someone in power that cared about protecting my liberty, in the form of Ron DeSantis. And so when you look at the Disney bill, what you had there is, for one, like, Disney acted in a way where, there's two different components of it. One is that Disney got involved in the smear campaign about the bill, where they, when they themselves were using the "don't say gay" language, which and I know from some of the behind the scenes stuff to it, like, you had an agreement with DeSantis and the Disney Corporation where Disney was going to meet gay employees at Disney that had problems with the bill. And then Disney blasted it with that sort of media created smear. And that made DeSantis view Disney as a bad faith actor, which I don't think is wrong.
Really?
The second thing,
can you back up on that for a little bit? There was another agreement that they had kind of behind the scenes before that whole scandal broke out into the open.
Yeah. So Disney got into the political game where at the end, after the bill was passed, Disney went and publicly blasted the bill as the "Don't Say Gay" bill. After they were already trying to work on like a fair dialogue about it, right? So that and so again, like they became an active mouthpiece to a propaganda campaign against the state, against lying, deceiving what was in the bill. The second part of it, though, is then you had the release tapes about Disney going out of its way to promote queerness, their word, not mine, and their children's content. And this gets into a larger issue, which is the way that you have very powerful companies seeking not profit as their guiding standpoint in terms of the operations of their business, but that they have a responsibility for other principles, be it diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the ESO scores. Right? In the past decade, we've seen a massive escalation from corporate America to demote this to deprioritize profit, where the consumers have say in how a company operates, right? Because it's kind of the consumer sovereignty sort of angle, to know some things matter more than profit. And it's these principles, and these principles are all to the left. And this goes back to the conversation we were having about the Fed, because we've created a situation where these companies are much larger in size than they otherwise would because of monetary policy subsidies. The biggest shareholders of these companies are BlackRock and these asset management companies that have the same ideological agenda. And so I think that if you're a libertarian and you are trying to use free market solutions to combat a problem where we no longer have a free market, like this is not a capitalistic system that we hold. I think that you're not playing by the rules of the game as it exists, and I don't think that's good for liberty. I don't think that is good for anything. I think we have deluded ourselves if you think that this can be solved without power. And effectively, what they want is they want to neuter. They want to give a monopoly of this use of this corporate state access. They want to give the left the monopoly of it, because the only thing corporations have ever had to fear for a very long time are left-wing activists, because conservatives have been willing to defend them as private businesses and yada yada yada. Now you have corporations; they have to worry about what Governor DeSantis is going to say if they're based in Florida. And again, as a Floridian, I think that helps create I think that's a useful guard against progressive hegemony. And in the use of corporate America as an extension of the regime. And again, it's something that in 2019, me probably would have been against this. But I do not take for granted the freedom that I've enjoyed, that many, many people have not. And there's Ron Paul or Ron DeSantis has done more for my freedom than even the great Ron Paul did. And so I think I'd be ungrateful if I was more willing to just kind of not think outside pre-existing political principles and not try to appreciate and respect the decision making that's going on through the steps that he's taking. And so that's kind of been my own personal journey in some of these issues.
Yeah. And it seems as though that the hope would be is to push some of these corporations, whether it be Disney in this case, back into some sort of a political neutrality.
Right.
Which, like you pointed out, that bill has like a year, is it, before
Yes.
it goes into effect?
Yes.
Which does seem as though it was designed to maybe give them some time for remorse and repentance.
Yeah, I think it is taking a grenade to a negotiation and pulling the pin, keeping the hammer squeezed, and saying, okay, now you see we mean business, because the whole thing's in Florida. Mickey Mouse was the most powerful actor in Florida for a very long time. And I mean, to the extent where 2021, not that long ago, the rat was able to carve out a big, juicy carve out in Ron DeSantis's anti-social media censorship thing. And you had people in the governor's, they were very concerned about making sure Disney was taken care of because they just have that sort of weight on things. They had effectively bought a large percentage of the Republican legislature. You had Chamber of Commerce types fighting tooth and nail against the vaccine mandate bill, and you had the Republican leadership in the state of Florida that was trying to distract voters by saying we're going to stop Biden's vaccine mandate and say nothing about the corporate vaccine mandate. Like, this is something that you just as someone that watches Florida politics a lot more than any sane person should, though watching state politics is always better than watching federal politics and that circus. You're seeing how quickly this has changed has been very interesting. And it's a whole new world in terms of Florida politics. And I think that I'm interested to see to what degree are the lessons learned in Florida shared with other Republican governors around the country. And to what degree are we actually seeing a Republican Party that can defend Republican voters? As much as I think Trump was a great reset from what the GOP had been, I think there's a lot of good things that came from that regime, that administration. I think that DeSantis is showing an effectiveness of power that we haven't seen in a very, very long time, and all the right people are concerned and upset, and the fact that they have to be a little bit more upset than they were 2 years ago, I think is a good thing. Even if you disagree with DeSantis, like, if you simply want to see not live under a one party regime like China, I think anything that can kind of just gum up the works. There's liberty to be had in not allowing a monopoly of power as well. And so if you want to be in New Hampshire and have a different sort of guiding principles, more power to you. I still very much believe in political decentralization. I just think that DeSantis is showing tools that Republicans can use that I hope will lead to some changes down the road.
Yeah, man. I hate that we only have about 8 minutes to spend on each one of these topics because there's so many more questions and things I have popping in my head. I wish we had like a Joe Rogan amount of time. We need 3 hours to be able to adequately go through any of these. So I wanted to get to this earlier, but let's talk about your making a little bit more personal turn, talking about your spiritual journey. I know that from following you on Facebook, you kind of went through you've been going through the spiritual journey the last couple of years. Tell us about that and some of the changes that you've been experiencing.
Well, again, it's just recognize, ever since, my libertarian days, it's individualism kind of becomes its own faith system in itself, liberty and what I've, kind of the recognition that individualism, for one, that individualism itself, I think, is based in a lie that we're not born as individuals. We're born into families. We're born into nations. We're born into stories like that transcend us as an individual. And recognizing that, ego and narcissism can lead to us to rationalizing things that are not good. I think that if you are that it is easy for libertarians to fall in the trap of pursuing individualism itself as the end goal, and it leads to the original sin, right, was very individualistic. The belief that the judgment of Adam and Eve was better than God. I think that there is a great failure to appreciate the importance of things bigger than yourself has often been an Achilles heel of libertarians, which has led to consequences that are detrimental to liberty itself. And so my own journey on this, and I'm still searching for churches. I'm not quite sure exactly where I'm going to end up in terms of the larger theological different debates, and that it has been very interesting pursuing a new something that I want to be very important and foundational in my life, and kind of dealing with a new frontier here, and visiting different churches and understanding the different histories here. But something that I've always been that I found very persuasive to me has been history and recognizing the profound difference that the example of Christ had on human morality as a whole, that how pivotal it has been to the success and growth of Western civilization, pivotal to America and it becoming the center that it had. Even if one was not persuaded, even if one had no broader theological appreciation, I think that refusing to recognize the empirical impact of this and to believe that this everything always gets better, the modernity is always better than what came before. Like there's a lot of these trappings that I've fallen into in the past that other libertarians have fallen into that I find lacking. And so, it has brought, it has brought me on a journey where we're trying to appreciate this new frontier and to come to understand and appreciate what it means to take God seriously. And it's something that, it's something that we're growing up in 1990s America, like, there's so much that we take for granted in just how Christianized America was. And I think as we've seen an acceleration on the left to promote cultural views that are explicitly hostile to that, and seeing the decay that I think comes with that. Again, like I think Europe is in a very, very bad place. And I think secularism is driving a big part of that. That the fear of death, the inability to, the disinterest in having children. I think a lot of progressivism is motivated by a hostility to humanity itself. And I think that is a byproduct of a very perverse form of liberal secularism. And I there's this Mises and Murray Rothbard, they themselves were agnostic or atheistic Jews. So I'm not going to say that, you can't be a good person without a higher faith. I think that there's always outliers out there, but the problem is when you ground a society based off of outliers. I think that creates issues. And so, the more that I see civilization coming to this dark place, the more that I come to realize my own failings. I find taking God seriously as a way of filling some of these holes that have been in my life, and then and holes that I think are in society right now, and it trying to take that one step at a time and trying to be a better person for it. And that's kind of my own journey. And it's a very, 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 at my own pace, but it has been an interesting frontier to experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like it. And those are some really profound thoughts. One of my favorite cultural commentator and Christian thinker is a guy named Os Guinness. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's been on this show 3 times. So if you're interested, you can go back and hear some of him. But he has this way of saying, I don't know if he coined it or if he took it from someone else, but he says that we live in a cut flower civilization. And what he means by that is that we've been living with, up until very recently, with all of the benefits and fruits and beauty that came from being rooted in the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so Western civilization had, to use the metaphor, that these flowers grown from the soil of the biblical worldview, but then 100 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more, were cut, and for a while the beauty remains, and they look alive, but eventually they're going to start to die and decay. And I think that's what you were talking about with that recognition of what happens whenever we abandon that biblical worldview that brought about so much human flourishing.
Well, and it's interesting because, this kind of ties back to the economic conversation, because the economists that really changed the way that economists viewed the science of economics was John Maynard Keynes. And John Maynard Keynes was born into a very powerful, elite British family, went to all the top schools, and he was a satanic pedophile. Like he was very autistic. So like he took like detailed notes of like all of his personal relationships. And like, I mean, he literally traveled to these poor countries in the Mediterranean and would rent the boys from the families who were destitute. And, you know, that's the way that they made money from these people. And you read the writings of him and his colleagues and partners, and it was all about explicitly the goal for breaking down and destroying the Christian bourgeois values of the West and the need to do that to accomplish great big things. And, you know, you go back and the French Revolution, obviously, I think a profound example of what a society that worships reason and not God falls into. The influence of there's a fascinating book that we have a PDF on Mises.org. Is Leftism Revisited by an Austrian noble whose name I can't pronounce, but like he highlighted the viewpoints of like Marquis de Sade, how prevalent they became within the modern intellectual left in the 20th century, despite him kind of dying in obscurity. Napoleon threw him in jail, which I think was a good thing for Napoleon. Neither here nor there. I've become a lot more fond of him of late. Where again, you read this guy, and like it is, abortion on demand, the need to sexualize children at an early age, the destruction of fatherhood. This is the stuff that is now. I don't think it's hyperbole, and I always try to check myself. Am I falling into the trap of being hyperbolic with people I disagree with? I don't think it's true in this case, where I think a lot of his views are mainstream within the modern progressive left, and not just in America but broadly. And these are bad people. And I think that it's fair to judge. I think that one of the things that I love at the Mises Institute is that my intellectual heroes were men I could be proud of. Ludwig von Mises, I think, was a great man. Murray Rothbard was a great scholar and a great man. Lou Rockwell, who's the founder of the Institute, was a great man. Those personal examples matter, and I think it is not a coincidence that people with very, very bad ideas live very, very bad lives, and that's the goal is to not be like that, and one step at a time.
Yeah. So in this journey, and in learning more about faith and theology and so on, how has that interacted with the work that you do as an economist? Do those overlap? Have you found that learning more about the Bible or the Christian worldview, have you found it to inform what you see in economics and society and so on?
Well, I think the nice thing is I think it reaffirms a lot of the views I already had, which perhaps might be might be an issue to someone who gets cognitive bias, but I do think that the core of money, like honest money, being so foundational to a thriving, prosperous society is important. And I think that because it is what has the value is not the picture of Caesar on the coin. It is that it represents truth. It allows individuals to make honest decisions with what they value, and the market kind of ends up responding to that. And I think it's precisely when it is the face of Caesar on the coin and not truth that's what's brought us to the society we have now. And I think it's interesting too. So if you look back in history, like I'm a big fan of the Jacksonians, and like their arguments for like laissez-faire, it's kind of a populist free market view of things, was very much grounded on civil virtue rather than like kind of materialism. And I think that's one of the problems that capitalism has. Most of our great defenses have been, look at how much cheap stuff we've got. And I'm not trying to dismiss cheap stuff. And I think anyone that does, chances are they've lived a very privileged life. And so they can't fully appreciate, how much it means to be able to have access to things that lower your own misery.
Yeah.
But that those aspects, it is, we can't defend, I think, a good society truly with simply materialistic impulses. It has to be something larger than us. and we should be in the interest of promoting a civilly good society, and again, these are, and that then leads to making moral judgments that you can't necessarily make purely on individualistic grounds. You can't make them necessarily purely on liberal grounds. I think that it requires having a value set beyond reason, and then the question is, what is that founded upon? And the more and more, I think God in Christ is the strongest foundation for that, rather than anything else that we can rationalize for ourselves. And I think that that is so. I it hasn't changed necessarily my economic views, but it has given me greater appreciation for for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that's a good result, and that's what should be expected. If you're following something that's not necessarily quote unquote scriptural, right? Whether it be an economic methodology, scientific philosophy, or anything else in the world, if it's true, right? If it's true because it's true, well, then the Bible is not going to contradict it, and it shouldn't change it. If anything, it should reinforce it and make it stronger. Because one of the things we believe as Christians is that since God is truth with a capital T, we would say, right? One of my favorite writers, a guy who passed away in the 80s, named Francis Schaeffer, he used to say, the Bible and the Christian worldview is true truth. He used to say, in his odd little way he would articulate things. But if that is the case, then all truth that exists, even outside of the Bible, applying to all of life, even economics, belongs to him. It's an expression of and a revelation of the way that he designed the world to operate. So yeah, I think that a reaffirmation, like you said, should be tested, because on the one hand, it could be confirmation bias. But on the other hand, it might just be a reaffirmation, and that should be celebrated.
Well, one of the interesting things is that, like Murray Rothbard's economic history, one of the things he highlights is the degree to which a lot of the great early economic advances were made within the Catholic Church. In that case, and it just often this sort of false dichotomy that kind of the modern world sort of pits on scientific advancement and faith. It's a lie, and that is. And what's interesting too is I think even within the kind of liberal dynamic, if you look at John Locke, and a lot of the Anglo liberal perspective, I mean, it was very much with respect for God, and that so the two do not have to be in conflict, and but I think trying to do one without the others is. I question whether that can survive in the long term. Yeah,
absolutely. I agree. And I think we're witnessing and experiencing the logical conclusions of what happens where you do try to sever that foundation. Well, Tho, we've gone well over our time. I apologize for that, but man, it's been great, and wish we had more time, but I'll go ahead and bring us to a close. Anything you want to plug before we go? Anything you want to point people to? Have them check out ways to connect with you.
Yeah, well, if anyone out there is interested in more Mises Institute content, one of the things we've been trying to do the last year or so is to produce a lot more kind of beginner-friendly content. So we've got a 9-part sort of basic economic video series that you can find at begineconomics.com. And then we also have just last week released What Has Government Done to Our Money, which will end up being a 9-part series about money and the Fed and all these issues that we talked about today. And you can find that at whathasgovernmentdonetourmoney.com.
Great. I'm going to have all of that linked in the show notes, so that if anyone is interested in checking it out, just click on the link to the show notes in the description below, and you'll be able to find those video series and the resources from Mises. So, Tho, just want to thank you again. Really enjoyed this conversation and enjoyed having you with us on Filter.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Aaron.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch up the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the aim.